1337. 1,000 years have passed since the death of Constantine the Great, the emperor who moved the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople and saw the glorious sign in the sky. Those 1,000 years were marked by cultural achievements, triumphs in battle, great successes in diplomacy, and advancements in administration and organized religion. However, all states faced their inevitable decline, and at the time, Eastern Rome spanned only a fraction of its once vast territories and could only project influence on a regional basis, as the mistakes of previous administrations have brought the state to its knees. To modern audiences, the Roman Empire in 3037 would be a state in terminal decline. In stark contrast to this belief, in this video we aim to show the dynamism of Byzantium, based on clear-cut events and data, while at the same time pointing out its weakest aspects that eventually led to its end 116 years later. Now, to achieve this detailed overview, we are going to first go over the territories that Constantinople controlled in 1337, their history, population, and key points. Next, we are going to examine the ruling elite, the emperor and his entourage that ran the imperial apparatus. Moving on, we will dive deep into the imperial revenue, the organization of the economy, the societal structure, and the church matters of the era. Last but not least, we are going to analyze the imperial forces on land and sea, as well as their capabilities to operate against Constantinople's enemies. First, we will assess the territories held by the Romans in 1337. Starting from the west, Epirus was the freshest of the imperial conquests. Having been accustomed to independent rule since the sack of 1204, the despotate of Epirus juggled for many years between alliances with the west and the Romans of Constantinople, ending up being ruled by the Orsini, an Italian-Greek family, after 1318. In 1337, after a campaign that also extended to parts of Albania, in response to Albanian raids on the territory, the government of Constantinople gained Epirus, a land with Greek population and relatively prosperous cities like Arta and Ioannina. Additionally, the region provided a protective shield against attacks from the west, thanks to the Pindus Mountains. Nearby lay Thessaly, also a traditionally Greek region that had experienced times of Roman rule, Epirot conquest and independence since 1204. The administration of Andronicus III Palaiologos managed to regain suzerainty over the region between 1334 and 1337. Thessaly would be an important producer of agricultural goods, while also possessing important fortified points like Trikala and Phanarion. Additionally, Thessaly also included a sizable Vlach population, a Latinized Balkan rural people who would serve as mercenaries and warriors for various regional powers. Moving south, Peloponnese was also lost by the Romans after 1204, being conquered by the French Duchy of Achaia. However, through war and clever diplomacy, Constantinople regained control over the southeastern part of the peninsula in 1262, establishing a power base around the fortified city of Mistras, close to the site of ancient Sparta. Squabbles against Catholic rulers of nearby lands were commonplace, with the region slowly but steadily coming under Roman rule. The lands of Morea would prove a valuable source of manpower and spiritual capital for the later years of the empire. On an economic level, the town of Monevassia, built on a huge rock connected to the mainland with a thin stretch of land, would be one of the main contributors to the imperial budget through trade and tax. Despite its relative prosperity, the Morea would be a distinct power base from the capital, with the administration of Mistras pursuing its independent campaigns and policies. Macedonia and Thrace were the core imperial domains throughout the 14th century. After the reconquest of 1261, the regions were consolidated, with Thessalonica, Adrianople, and Constantinople being the most important urban centers, but certainly not the only ones. The regions were relatively wealthy, even though they had suffered the Catalan raids in 1304 and the dividing civil war of 1321 to 1328. Nevertheless, Macedonia and Thrace were far from safe and prosperous. The kingdoms of Bulgaria and Serbia loomed along the northern border. Failed Byzantine attempts to control Bulgaria had led to losses, bringing the borders more and more south. Meanwhile, Serbia had also initiated offensives against the Romans under its new and energetic leader, the man who was said to become the greatest Serbian monarch, Stefan Dusan. In 1337, his ambitions were just starting to materialize, as with the help of a Roman traitor, Syrianus Palaiologos, the Serbians managed to conquer the important fortresses of Ohrid, Prilep, and Strumitsa, amongst others. All in all, the population of Macedonia and Thrace would be predominantly Greek at that point, but with deep feelings of distrust against the government, coupled with societal divide, especially in the big cities. Thessalonica, the second city of the empire in size, had a wealthy merchant class, was well fortified, and produced important literary works, boasting a population of around 50,000, a number certainly impressive for the age. Possibly third in size, Adrianople would be an important center of power, possibly more than 10,000 inhabitants, protected by the nearby fortress city of Didymoteichon. The Romans would still hold dominion over a substantial part of the Aegean Islands, especially in the northeastern part of the archipelago. Thassos, Limnos, Symvros and the Sporades would be almost permanent holdings of the Romans. However, Limnos and Chios and even possibly Samos and Icaria would prove even more impressive. The islands, along with the neighboring towns of the New and Old Phocaea, would consist of a small trading crusader state under the Genoese Zaccaria family, starting from the 1270s. The Zaccaria would enrich themselves through the alumni mines of Phocaea and would assert their power over the region, often defeating Turkish base and local pirates. With the new administration in power on the Roman throne, the relations with the Zaccaria soured, and the Romans organized an expedition against the Zaccaria possessions, reincorporating their lands into the empire. In 1337, despite successes on other fronts, the situation in Asia Minor was dire. Nicomedia, once an important Byzantine center, fell to the hands of the Ottomans in the same year, but some Roman outposts still existed in the coasts of Marmara. These cities included Lampsakos and Abydos, once ancient Greek colonies that were now flooded with Greek refugees from other parts of the now conquered Anatolia. Additionally, control over the region of Chalcedon does not appear to be lost, while some ports may still have endured even more to the north, like the port of Heraclea. To the south, the former possession of the Zaccaria, Phocaea, was freshly incorporated into the empire, while in the interior, Philadelphia still endured as it lay in the junction of several Turkish beyliks, and its Greek inhabitants heavily fortified the town. This situation would persist for 50 more years. However, the big picture is that the once firm possessions in Asia Minor were now inundated by the Turks. The Ottomans, the Saruhanids, the Aydinids and the Karasids all exercised their dynamism in the region, with numerous and skillful warriors at their disposal. The same base, however, would at times be valuable allies and providers of mercenaries to the Romans. Last but not least, the crown jewel amongst these possessions would of course be Constantinople. The ancient city would still endure as the most populated and prestigious, not only the area, but in the entirety of Europe and the Middle East. However, its strength and importance was greatly diminished compared to earlier centuries, especially after the sack of 1204. Its population for 1337 can be estimated to be around 50 to 70,000 people, with estimates even claiming 100,000. Much less than its peak, around 500,000 during the times of Justinian, with gardens and farms covering a big part of the territory inside its mighty walls, even up to 2/3 of it. Nevertheless, Constantinople still made a great impression on the famous traveler Ibn Battuta, as he described the city as full with people and splendorous, with bustling markets and a busy harbour. Wealthy individuals possessed impressive estates with baths, pools, and a variety of exotic animals. Additionally, the city was the see of the Patriarch of the Orthodox world, overseeing all other patriarchates, while the palace of the Emperor and the famous Hagia Sophia were some of the most impressive buildings anyone could witness at the time. In 1337, Emperor Andronicus III ruled as an ideal alternative to his grandfather, Andronicus II. Andronicus the Elder's legacy was one of the worst of the era. He had lost big parts of Anatolia, disbanded the imperial fleet, dismissed the empire's most capable general, Alexius Philanthropinos, lost lands to Bulgaria, and allowed the Catalan fiasco. A conspiracy of powerful men of the era formed under Ioannis Katakouzinos in order to dispose of Andronikos the Elder and install Andronikos III in his place. Ioannis Katakouzinos was a wealthy nobleman of the era, with a great fortune, fine education, and land holdings in the Peloponnese and Macedonia. Being an extremely ambitious man, he constructed a web of individuals who he helped raise in positions of power. Members of his circle were Alexios Apokafkos, manager of the salt mines and later one of the empire's head ministers. Syrianis Palaiologos, a scheming aristocrat with half Mongolian roots. Theodore Synadinos, an army's general. And John Kalekas, a man who later became patriarch. The trigger for the conspiracy to fire was the expulsion of Andronikos the Young to Adrianople, an event that the conspirators used to their advantage to launch a civil war that lasted until 1328 and ended with the deposition of Andronikos the Elder. Katakouzinos and his clique, along with Andronikos III, would be the ones commanding the fortunes of the state while creating massive fortunes for themselves. Just to put into perspective Katakouzinos' wealth and influence in 1337, he claimed that in 1341 he owed 5,000 herds of cattle, 1,000 teams of oxen for plowing, 2,500 mares, 200 camels, 300 mules, 500 donkeys, 50,000 pigs, and 70,000 sheep. Trying to translate this in cash would be tricky, but we can deduce that his fortune would have been immense when he refused to accept a small sum of 60,000 hyperpira in order to not damage his reputation, in his own words. This sum at the time would amount from 20 to 30,000 Venetian jackets, a sum comparable to Andronikos the Elder's entire estimated fortune and a fifth of the massive fortune of the Megisti Lavra monastery at the time. Calling this sum insignificant could indicate an impressive amount of wealth was amassed for Katakouzinos' coffers, even if his records are to be taken with a grain of salt. The members of his clique would also gain impressive power, with Alexios Apokafkos becoming finance minister and later great admiral, allowing for him to build a fortified estate and then privately finance with 100,000 hyperpira the renewal of the Roman fleet. In the meanwhile, the hunger for lands and power led Syrianis Palaiologos to join the side of the Serbians in attacking and occupying fortresses in Macedonia, just for him to be killed by the emperor's agents later on. Additionally, John Kalekas, who rose from a simple priest to patriarch, would assert great influence over the populace spirituality, while Theodore Synadinos gained the governorship of Epirus. One other important member of the ruling elite was Anna of Savoy, the wife of the emperor and daughter of a count from northwestern Italy. The members of the once united Katakouzinos clique would try to gain influence over her, as she would be the one giving birth to the emperor's successor. In the meanwhile, the emperor would probably prove the least power-hungry within his circle, starting as a joyful and reckless youth, even causing the accidental death of his brother, and spending most of his time in banquets with other young aristocrats. He was expelled by his grandfather, Andronikos the Elder, to Adrianople, sparking the civil war between them in 1321. Katakouzinos tried to gain the young man's friendship in order to advance his own ambitions, and it is possible that without his influence, Andronikos would have never managed, or even attempted perhaps, to gain the throne himself. Despite his unpromising beginnings, however, Andronikos became an energetic monarch, spending much of his time in military campaigns and deeply caring for the empire. But at the same time, he was driven by impulse and lacked long-term strategic thinking, while being easily influenced by his advisors. Under Andronikos, the powerful clique of John Katakouzinos was tasked with running the Roman state. As seen, their actions in external policy were relatively successful, but the tensions between them, coupled with the ones within the society, could spark chaos. The state revenues in 1337 can only be estimated by approximation, really. 16 years prior, in 1321, based on the accounts of Nikiforos Grigoras, the state's revenues would amount to around 600,000 Venetian ducats. The civil war that followed would have lowered that amount, but the subsequent resurgence and reconquests we can assume to have risen it to at least a comparable level. This would be a significant sum for the era, as based on the historian Michael Hendy's research, this would put the Romans amongst the wealthiest states of the era, compared to Britain and France, while much wealthier than Naples and Florence. The economy of the state was greatly transformed throughout the centuries. Land losses and trade privileges granted to Italian maritime republics greatly diminished the presence of Greek merchants outside the empire's borders. Yet, their presence is still recorded, with many of them even originating from the port of Monevassia. The state would still benefit from trade, but the amount was minimal. Based on Michael Hendy, Constantinople's trade revenue is estimated in 1348 to be around 20,000 Venetian ducats, just 1/5 of that of the Genoese colony of Galata. Given the dire consequences of the events that befell the empire in the decade after 1337, we can assume that this sum would be larger for the Romans at the time, but this still would only consist of a small sum of the imperial revenue. Most of the state revenues would come from taxes imposed on individuals and goods, as the Roman market was transformed into a consumer economy during the Paleologan era. Wealthy aristocrats possessed large estates that were used to produce agricultural goods, which fueled the huge urban populations of the two metropolis of the empire, and other smaller urban centers as well. The aristocracy in turn would seek luxury goods created either in workshops inside the same cities or even imported from Italian and Greek merchants from abroad. The rural landowner elite would generally live in the countryside in the large estates, but would reside in the cities during the winter months. Additionally, open city markets, the panigiris, would be commonplace in the empire and would consist of opportunities for the wealthy landowners to spend their capital, while the urban middle class would also benefit from this exchange. However, this economic structure is destined to create societal divides. The wealthy landowners and aristocrats, as well as the people working in their estates, would often come to disagreement against the food-dependable urban populations of the cities, as their interests would not align always politically. But even if the landowners like Katakouzinos had immense wealth and even control of large segments of the army, the urban populations would still influence the imperial administration in the palace and the church. Those institutions were dependable in the urban populations both geographically and for their manpower needs. Thus, the urban ruling elite, church administration and wealthy business owners would be the ones primarily drafting policies and could be easily toppled from within the city due to the proximity and numbers if the population became too unsatisfied. And thus, a delicate balance would keep the society running. The Eastern Roman society would be a deeply religious one all across the societal strata, with people holding religious posts exerting great influence in the drafting of state policies through theological debates. The most prominent of such debates would be the one around hesychasm, the practice of repeating a short prayer without interruption almost on a constant basis by monks in order to achieve inner peace. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. The practice, developed in the monastic communities of Mount Athos, was deemed as too mystical by some Western-minded religious men like Barlaam of Calabria, who came into a religious post at the time in Constantinople and was scandalized when he was informed of the practice, in his own words. This sparked a massive debate as more and more church officials and theologians took the side of Barlaam. The debate had social and political implications and was only solved after two synods in 1351. Besides the imperial administration, core institutions of the empire were the army and the navy. Regarding the army, the total forces of the empire and their composition are hard to estimate, but some information can be deducted based on the campaigns conducted during the era. For starters, the army would compose of both permanent and mercenary forces. The permanent troops were mainly garrisons that were stationed around key locations and cities throughout the imperial domains, while on offensive campaigns there would have been a more extensive use of mercenaries. In several cases, however, both defensive and offensive forces would include both types of troops. Diving into the permanent forces, the fortresses besieged by the Serbians of Stefan Dusan were heavily fortified and only fell with treason, indicating a well-equipped and numerous garrison. That would have also been the case with the Dimotichon, Philadelphia, or even Constantinople, where the defenses seem to have been properly manned, either by professional local soldiers or militias, raising the total number of permanent troops to at least a few thousand. Additionally, in the campaigns against the Zaccaria possessions in 1334, the Varangian Guard is also mentioned, which would have also been a permanent force, perhaps consisting of Greeks or Greekified Scandinavians at that point. Another point of information would have been the campaign of Katacousinos in Asia Minor that led to the defeat at Pelekanos in 1329. There, the Romans fielded 4,000 troops, 2,000 of whom landed there from Constantinople, but it is not certain whether they were mercenaries or local conscripts, or even armed refugees from Asia Minor. Another important battle would be the one at Rusokastron in 1332 against the Bulgarians, where the Romans fielded 3,000 troops, but still their composition remains uncertain. What is to be noted here, though, is that both in Pelekanos and Rusokastron, the Romans initiated offensive expeditions with much less troops than the enemy, as their enemies would outnumber the Byzantine army several times in size in both cases. Both instances led to defeats, but could the action itself signify a qualitative advantage of the Romans, or were those cases just strategic blunders? This cannot be answered with certainty either. One more distinguishing characteristic of Roman troops would be the ones performing stratiotiki, military, or tsakoniki, guard service. The first type of service would be prestigious and combat-related, while the tsakones would carry on more mundane tasks like night watch or police services, usually fit for older or weaker troops. Mercenary troops could either be Greek or Vlach locals, like it is attested in the newly conquered Epirus region, or they could be foreign peoples like Alans, a people famous for their light cavalry tactics, organized Serbian contingents, mounted Latin knights, from Italy, Spain or Germany, perhaps the most reliable and dangerous force of the era, and, most importantly, Turks. Most memorable is the case of Turkish mercenaries that were provided by Omur of Aydin, a personal friend of John Katacousinos, as 2,000 of them were used in a campaign against Albanian raiders. Those men seem to not have received formal payment, instead being motivated by loot and booty. Many of those units, excluding the Turks, usually had Greek commanders, as it was the case of Theodoros Synadinos, Syrianis Palaiologos, or Alexios Tsaplakon. Last but not least, the navy was an integral part of the Roman state. Having been almost completely disbanded by Andronicus II 50 years earlier, the navy would amount to just 10 to 20 trade ships at the start of Andronicus III's rule. Despite that, in the naval expedition against the Zaccaria, a fleet of 100 vessels was a must. This fleet would also include allied ships from the Knights of Rhodes, or merchant ships armed for war, but the investment of Alexios Apokafkos would have definitely added permanent warships to the Byzantine navy by the time. Under Apokafkos, who held the position of Grand Admiral, the navy would see an even bigger resurgence in the coming years. As seen, the empire in 3037 was a living tapestry. The bustling metropolis of Thessalonica and Constantinople provided the state with administrative and spiritual knowledge, while the peripheries, including the newly conquered territories, would provide the state with manpower, natural borderlands, and agricultural goods. This urban agrarian divide would extend within the ruling elite, as its members would try to support one faction over the other in order to increase their fortunes and influence. The entourage, organized by John Katacousinos, the power behind the throne, would soon fracture into the same factions. But despite the divides, solutions could be found. The new emperor, despite his overambitious circle of advisors, was keen on cutting down on corruption and actively pursued campaigns against Constantinople's enemies. Those were numerous on the exterior, but they would be kept at bay and even defeated with organized effort. The economic strength of the empire, still amongst the wealthiest states of the era, could be used to acquire mercenaries or armed garrisons, measures that proved relatively effective, at least on the European side of the imperial domains. The religious divides could be healed by capable leadership, as it actually happened with the hesychast dispute. All in all, the empire may have stood internally divided, but the renewal of its elite, coupled with the permanent advantages that the state possessed, its prestige, educated population, and material and spiritual wealth, could be just enough to lead the way through the tumultuous times that lay ahead. The universal strength of the Roman Empire of Constantine the Great may have been long gone 1,000 years after his death, but the legacy he left behind was still alive in 1337.